And thank you very much for joining us here on PM Express. It is a big night indeed when it comes to the IMF bailout that we are seeking to get. And there's a statement that was issued today by the government announcing that the IMF team, they arrive in the country tomorrow. And they're going to be beginning in-person meetings with government officials as part of the conversation and negotiations towards an IMF program. The government has assured in that statement that it is determined and committed to get an IMF program as soon as possible, but one that will serve the best interest of the Ghanaian people. And so we need to ask the question, how do we get a deal we can live with? It is a very important question that we need to ask. What should this program look like? A program that will serve your interest and everybody else's interest. What should it look like? We're going to get into that with my guests when they join me shortly for a conversation. But before we do that, I want to do some numbers and get into some of the numbers shortly for you, just to understand, first of all, why we are where we are, but also the implications and how we got here. It's important to understand first that we have 16 times gone to the IMFs in our history as a country since independence, right? This is the 17th time, if indeed we get a program. And I say if because it is no guarantee that because the president directs the finance minister to go to the IMF, that the IMF will grant us a program. It is not a guarantee. If you go to the bank to withdraw to get a loan, you have to meet some basic requirements. You must first, the barest minimum, prove to the bank that you can pay back if they give you the money. The IMF operates like that too, in that sense. And so we are asking for some money. The government of Ghana says you're going to the IMF primarily for balance of payment support, right? But they must prove that they can pay back. So this conversation is a long conversation. We are not anywhere near getting that deal. It has to be negotiated. It'll come with some conditions, and we have to wait for that. So 17th, if we get to the door, if we manage to succeed in convincing the IMF that there are programs that we will put forth, because now the IMF has changed the way it works. You have to come with your own medicine, right? What is our medicine? What medicine are we proposing that we want to take ourselves? In the last time we went, the government by this time already had a program, a set of policies they were proposing that the IMF looked at and said, we endorse, go and take the medicine. So what is the medicine that we're proposing to the IMF that we will take? Some of these numbers will tell us a story of, what is going to be a pretty difficult negotiation for us as a country. Because look at this. If you look at all the bailouts that we've received from the IMF since 1999, this is the Fourth Republic in the last 30 years, right? It comes down to a total of $1.96 billion. That's everything that the IMF has given us since 1999. In 1999, we went for 303 million. The last time we went, in 2015, that was a $900 million we got. If you put all that together, in 30 years, the IMF has only given us $1.96 billion. In the scheme of things, that's a mighty drop, right? But we go to the IMF for this because mostly it's beyond how much we get. The credibility they give us, the validation they give us, the fact that they almost all of a sudden overnight, it makes us credit worthy again. So we can go back and borrow on the Eurobond market. Now we are shut out from the market. So there's more to what the IMF brings to us than this amount. But I want you to keep your eye on this amount because it's important. In the monetary terms, 1.96 billion total amount of money we've gotten from the IMF since 1999 in 30 years. Why is that number important? If you compare to this, then the number becomes a bit more interesting. Because as I've said, from 1999 to 2015, the four programs that we've gone to the IMF for, all totaled just 1.96 billion. Do you know how much we got in 2020 from the IMF for COVID support alone? That's the number here, 2.4 billion in 1 year. 2.4 billion. That is almost twice as much as we've got in 30 years from the IMF. So it begs the question, What did we use the $2.4 billion for? Because after we've received this amount, we return to the IMF. Now, you remember that we got this amount from the IMF and the other supports that had come in from the World Bank, and the World Bank country director has spoken about this extensively, that they give us some money, right? IMF give us some money, other international partners give us some money, all amounting to this. So we got a lot of money, 2.4 billion. I mean, and the IMF is giving us 1.96 billion. And if you look at this, this is a source of this, IMF SDR calculations and then finance statements. That's where we got this amount from. That's a source of this. So the question needs to be asked, do you know how much you are asking the IMF for? According to the information minister, we are expecting something at the upper limit of $3 billion, right? But in 2020, because of COVID, we got this support, IMF, World Bank, others, 2.34 billion. So this couldn't solve our problem. Will 3 billion, assume we get that money, would it change anything? What would it change? Let's pay attention to that as we move. One of the reasons why we have to turn to the IMF is what this graph tells us. This graph shows us something. This is us living above our means. Because that line you see above here is expenditure, and that line you see below in yellow is the revenue. Consistently since 2012, we've been living above our means. 2012, we were very close. But then we climbed and climbed and climbed. But then look at what happened in 2019. 2019, the increase began, the gap began to widen, and which is important, right? Began to widen. And see how we're spending whilst we're raising low revenues. To the point where in 2022, we are talking about 137 billion cedis in terms of what we are spending, and we're raising some 100 million. So you're living beyond your means as a country. It's a very important point. And as I've said, at the time that we're getting the $2 billion from IMF, World Bank, etc., in 2020, we're still spending quite a lot of it. The question really needs to be asked. So this graph here, when we got that amount, what did we use all that money for? It's a key question that we've asked. And we've seen that today. More than 30 CSOs have come together asking the government to account for that money because it's important. That's one of the reasons we are going. Now, as I said at the beginning, the government has reiterated this point quite forcefully. Now, the primary reason why we are going to the IMF is to get balance of payment support, right? Now, this tells a picture. This is why government is going. Remember that this amount, the 430 million, is in the negative. The negative. So that is the picture. 430 million. This is the first quarter of 2021. We are comparing that, right, in 2021. Compare that to 2022 first quarter. We are 934 million in the red. That's significant. We're talking about dollars here. So we need this support urgently. Other than that, we're going to run out of, reserves to bring stuff into the country. If you look at Sri Lanka, what's happening in Sri Lanka is they are unable to even raise, money to bring in crucial, critical stuff like, energy and bringing in fuel for the country. There's shortages all over the place because you can't find the money to bring it in. That is how critical this is, and that's why government is going to the IMF primarily to get support to possibly bring this into the positive. So this is significant. And that tells a story. Now, Ghana's economic outlook, and I pull this up to tell you a story. The last time we went to the IMF, 2015, and now, what are the indicators? And and do a comparison, what does it say about now compared to then? And to tell you how difficult this negotiation is going to be. Because if we look at exchange rate by May, or the time that we went in 2015, the exchange rate was 19.9% against the dollar. So it wasn't good. Because if we compare to 2022 now, by May, we're doing 15.8. So that's the slight positive that you see that time to now. But the rest of the indicators are pretty bleak. If you look at inflation by May, the time we went to the IMF the last time in 2015, we're doing 16.9% inflation. Do you know what inflation is right now? 27.6%. That is a very important difference in telling us where we are as a country, as an economy. Gross international reserves, and this is one of those areas that when it starts hitting the red, countries begin to panic. At the time that we went in 2015, we're doing 4.8 billion. That is 3.3 months of import cover. And this, by the way, is according to the Bank of Ghana summary data. Currently, we are doing 3.7 months of import cover. So if you look at it closely, the difference in terms of its impact on us, it's very slim. Although if you look at it in real terms, we are still 8.3 billion. So that is a slight positive there. But the debt to GDP ratio for me is the biggest thing. Remember what I said at the beginning, that the IMF will loan us some money. It will be cheaper than what we've got elsewhere, commercial rate. However, they're still loaning us some money. We have to prove that we can pay it back. So your debt to GDP ratio must be sustainable. You have to first see if you can pay back. Is your debt levels, are your debt levels sustainable? And the time we went to the IMF in 2015, our debt to GDP was 66.5%. Now we are 78%. And even then, if you read the IMF document surrounding 2015, they kept stressing that our debt level at 66.5% was unsustainable. Now we are 78%. So this will play a huge factor. If the IMF insists, like they did the last time, that you must do something about your debt level before we give you some money, then we are in real deep trouble with this particular amount here. And very interestingly to note, I'll come to that and I'll show you what the picture says. When the IMF came in 2015, the target, when they asked Dr. Tufosi and co to be disciplined, the target was to reduce our debt to GDP to 50% within a decade, right? And the IMF, having seen our program, said we endorse it. We think if we implement this program, you can reach 50%. Obviously, this tells us that we failed. We have gone significantly backwards because target of 50%, we're doing 78%. Now, the current president, when they were exiting the IMF, made an announcement that because of the challenges that we faced in the last time we went to the IMF, he was going to institute fiscal measures. And one of the measures that he announced was that we should not exceed debt to GDP of more than 65%. That was the president announcing that was the government's objective and target. Obviously, again, they have failed in that. That was the target they set for themselves. We are at 78%. Of course, they will blame COVID. But you got 2.4 billion to deal with COVID. Now, tax to GDP ratio by March, 4.2%. That was in 2015. We are talking about 2020 of 2.6%. That's another big red there, an improvement over what used to be. And then first quarter GDP growth was 10.8%. So at that time we were doing quite well in the first quarter, GDP of 10.8%. Now we're doing 3.3%. Now, again, another key thing that has come up that you need to pay attention to in this so-called Ghana's revenue outlook for 2022 first quarter. If we are to prove to the IMF that we can pay back and we can qualify for this, then we must show that we can raise enough revenue locally. And one of the ways that we can prove that is how much tax are we going to bring in? And if you look at the table here, it's not looking good because if we budgeted tax revenue of 80 billion, we are doing 12.9 billion in the first quarter provisional. So if assuming this is going to be what we're going to be working with, we're going to end the year with just about 50 billion. But this is minus Elevy. So if you factor Elevy in, can the Elevy move us from 50 plus billion to 80 billion as we've targeted? That is asking a lot of the Elevy. And we know that the Elevy is not giving us as much. So again, if you look at here, the taxes that we are expecting and what we are actually getting in, the story isn't good. And that goes into the negotiators. When they sit down tomorrow and they open their books, the IMF will see this and say, goodness me, can we give them a program? And can they pay back what we give them? They'll look at these numbers. Finally, as we look at this, remember that the last time we went to the IMF, Seth Terkper and his team, the government, went with homegrown policies. They presented that to the IMF, and the IMF looked at it, make changes, etc., and they went back and forth and agreed. The closest this government has to that, the closest they've come to that is this raft of measures Ken Ofori-Atta announced at a major press conference a few months back. What did he announce? He announced that they were going to pass the e-levy, which has been passed, and so that's a revenue measure, is good. He announced a cut in discretionary spending by 30%. That again was good. Moratorium on purchase of imported vehicles for the rest of the year. He announced that. Eliminate ghost workers from the government payroll. And I assure you, look at all the programs that we've gone to the IMF for. That is one thing they insist we put in our program, right? Ghost names, workers, rationalization, reduces excess capacity payments is one thing that will save us some money by 20%. Moratorium on establishment of new public sector institutions and others. The key question is, these set of measures were announced by Ken Ofori-Atta a few months ago. It still hasn't moved the needle enough. Reason why we are going to the IMF. So we need to ask, what else is the IMF going to tell us to do that the finance minister didn't already announce the last time? Is it that they announced it but they haven't followed, and now the IMF will ensure that we abide? Because 30% cut in discretionary spending is quite significant. So really, what else is the IMF going to ask us to do? Now, if you compare to the measures that we saw in 2015, these were Setekpe's measures. Payroll cleanup was a key thing. Bringing wage bill to revenue ratio down from 53 to, and I bet you we're going to probably see something in this program as well. The wage bill is a big matter. This was a Setekpe target that the IMF agreed to. Freeze public sector employment. No, there was a net freeze. That's a difference. It's a very technical term, but it's a net freeze. In other words, you don't employ if you don't need to. If you lose an employee, you have to employ. That was the only condition there surrounding employment. And maybe we might see that as well. But the workers have already started complaining. Review tax exemptions, progressively eliminate government financing of SOEs, prioritize spending to clear domestic arrears, bring debt to GDP ratio to 50% in the decade, which I mentioned earlier. As we've seen, clearly we've missed that as a country over time under this current government. So that is the picture. You're beginning to appreciate what the challenge is going to be for our negotiators when they sit down, because the books aren't good. If you compare to the 2015 scenario, we are in more difficult times now than before in terms of the numbers. Some of them are good. Some of them, are good. Our reserve situation is better than then. But you're looking at a debt to GDP ratio. For me, that's key, of 78% compared to 66 just above there. And so that's going to be key. My guests are going to join me now because I need to ask them the question. Government had said that they want to get into a program that will bring us, that will be good for this economy, right? And as quickly as possible. What should that program look like? And on the back of the evidence that we've seen, what are going to be the hurdles that we need to cross when the IMF opens the book? You see there, my guest is joining me for a conversation. You have Dr. Atufor. He was the finance minister, deputy finance minister, so he knows a thing or two about the IMF and how they do its business. We'll also be joined by Dr. Tua Champon, an economist, to look at this. That fundamental question we need to ask is, so what would this look like? What would this program look like? Or what should it look like to serve your interest and mine as well? My guest is joining me after this break. Thank you for staying with us. My guests are with me now. Dr. Atufor. It's important to talk to him because obviously he's had direct experience of being there when the last time we went to the IMF. And so I'm delighted that he joins me with that background to this conversation. He's a ranking member of the Finance Committee of Parliament and MP Jumako Enyan Essien constituency. Also joining me is Professor Ibo Texing. He's Associate Professor of Development Economics and Program Coordinator, Economic Policy Management, Department of Economics, University of Ghana. We will be joined shortly by economist Dr. Tua Champon, who will join us also shortly on this conversation as we begin to look at what government can possibly get from the IMF. And I want to quickly start with this statement that the government issued today. Ms. Atufor, this is the government announced that the IMF team is arriving tomorrow to begin the negotiations, and they say that it takes the opportunity to assure Ghanaians of the government's commitment to successfully negotiate a program with the IMF in the coming months. Question is, on the back of everything else that I just presented, government says commitment to successfully negotiate. What would that successful program look like? And are they guaranteed to get it?
Evans, it is refreshing to get a statement from government, obviously, stating the position of government. I think that is really in the right direction. But I beg to say that it is not that simple to just announce a program. You certainly will have to negotiate, and you have to negotiate in good faith. You need to be committed to the process. And as to whether the public, you will get a buy-in to do what is required of you is another matter. And that is why I am particularly disturbed at government communication today.
Okay.
Listening to government communicators, and I mean senior ministers and others of state who have had the opportunity to speak, most of them are not confronting the problem and getting the public buy-in. Rather, they are saying we are where we are because of Russia and Ukraine war. And I find that very, very, very difficult to accept. In fact, it makes me think that this government is oblivious to the fact that there are certain things that they have to do. I would have thought that around this time of the year, and things now that you have announced the program, you will need to let the people of this country know the magnitude of the problem that we are in and get them prepared for the measures that you have to eventually take.
Yeah.
Evans, in the middle of all of this is the unsustainable debt. It is the debt that has brought us to where we are. You know, Ghana's public debt today is not only unsustainable, but it is in a high debt distress situation. As a result of our unsustainable debt, Ghana, one, lost access to the international capital market, not this year, 2021. In fact, we lost confidence, investor confidence. And as a result, domestic foreigners who are investing in our domestic bonds started leaving, in fact, disinvesting in our bonds to the extent that they exited, and we saw huge capital flows reversal leaving the country. As a result of that, you know what happened? Ghana started losing reserves, and that is why you could see the BOP deficit. You see, so from 20, if your research team had done quarter to quarter, you would have seen it rising. So the first quarter,
from 400 to 900.
Exactly. It didn't just get there; it started rising, and the investors started disinvesting at the time. And government, you could see that from 2017, they've been consistent, going to the bond market to borrow approximately $3 billion every year, starting from Franklin Templeton in 2017. Okay, so you could see that because they lost access to the market, they were not building the reserves on the back of borrowings. So the true situation confronted us. And again, domestic investors, I mean, foreigners who are investing in our domestic bonds also started leaving, and we saw it. That in itself brought a lot of pressure on the Ghanaian cedi. You know what happened? The cedi started depreciating, and it started bringing about inflation. Because obviously, you convert your cedi to $1 to go and buy a petroleum product to the country, and it started moving, even before Ukraine war. And that is why I cannot accept the Ukraine war as a reason why we are where we are. Yes, it may have played some part, but that cannot be the reason. So you saw that it started going up. And then we saw inflation issues. I mean, the cost pushed through to inflation. We saw it coming up back then. Then it started bringing about cost of living issues. People started complaining that cost of living index is going up and all of that because, again, of the currency and the structure of the Ghanaian economy. Because a lot of traders will need to change cedis to dollars to go out there to bring it. So it started affecting prices. Then government started responding. And the way government responded was to introduce some taxes, obviously because they have lost access to capital market, and then they needed to get some finance in domestic.
Hence the e-levy.
The e-levy, not only e-levy, but they introduced the benchmark values reversals. So that 50% benchmark values reversals also increases the cost of certain items coming in, also actually moved up and increased the inflation issues. So I saw this back in 2021. That is when, immediately after the first quarter, then we saw it actually happening. This government did not listen, even though we warned. They were of the view that they will use the 2022 budget to correct it. But unfortunately, the very day that the 2022 budget was read, investors got even more angrier because they saw an unrealistic budget assumption. And they said, what is this? Does these people think we are kids? And you can go back and plug. You will see that the yields with our bonds before and after the budget was read became very huge. Anybody can see it. It is not because of the e-levy. In fact, it was far before the budget was rejected and e-levy was subsequently rejected. This was on the day the budget was read. Investors reacted and said that we are not seeing what we have to see. So if you ask me, the 2022 budget will go down in history as the budget that lost the confidence of Ghanaian investors. It's the budget that has done us in, and it will stand to be the worst budget in the history of this republic. That is a fact, because the evidence is there to show the budget was prepared with only one major fiscal assumption, e-levy, that to bring in excess of 1% of GDP, in fact about 1.5% of GDP, in terms of quantum of tax revenue.
But the government said that your frustration of the e-levy really triggered a series of events that has led us here.
No, that is why I'm saying it's not true. So I've chronicled what happened from first quarter 2021 to what actually all on the back of the debt. You saw it piling up and piling up and piling up and piling up. They're only looking at one thing. In fact, Ghana's yields at the international bond market got worse on the day the budget was read than the day the e-levy was rejected. So it is, and this one is for anybody to see. You can go to Bloomberg Terminal and plug it. You will see it. The graph is there for everybody to see it. So that cannot be the reason.
So the problems are very obvious for everybody to see.
It's obvious.
The key question is, so we've decided to go. I mean, that is an admission that everything you've said largely is true. I mean, on the face of it, the documents show. I mean, once we decided to go. So we are going to negotiate. I guess now it's what I was driving at is the question about, so what would this program look like and what should it?
Okay,
so stay with me. I want to come back, go to my guests and bring them into this conversation. Professor Texing, thank you for staying with me. I mean, so one of the key things I want to pick your thoughts on. If you go back to 2015, I'm just reading the IMF, staff assessment of us and when they decided to give us. One of the key things that they emphasized then, when our debt to GDP was just 66% plus, they quote, the rapidly rising public debt resulted in significantly higher interest payment, further constraining social and development spending. And they went on to make the point that that is one of the key things that the government needed to address. One, to get the money, and so the government had to show that they can actually bring it down to 50% of GDP within a decade. And of course, they proved that they can do that. Of course, the IMF then agreed for them to go. Considering that we are 78% now, how much of a problem does this pose to the team that is beginning the negotiations tomorrow?
Thank you, Evans, and good evening to your viewers. I must say that the issues that we have as a country has to do with certain basic structural bottlenecks that Ghana faces. And the condition that we were in 2015, when we went to the IMF, the conditions are still prevalent. And nothing has changed since that time. If anything at all, Ghana started very well after the last program. And as of 2019, we had macro indicators that looked good. Interest rates were down. We're gaining access to the Eurobond markets. But the resilience that our economy needed had not been built. That was the reform that we're going through with the IMF when COVID hit. If COVID had not hit and Ghana had continued on the programs that we had done with the IMF, and when we were exiting, we were promising to continue, I think that the story today would have been different. But COVID hit us. The sort of medium to long-term solutions that our economy needed for us to stop this visit to the IMF at the least opportunity, we are not carrying them through. So our economy is where it was like it was in 2015. And so nothing has changed. Even anything else at all, there are two external factors that Ghana has no control over. that has only exacerbated our problem and made it better to us that, hey, we still got a lot to do. So if you ask me, nothing has changed. And the conditions that you listed that we went to the IMF with to negotiate are the similar conditions that we are going to go this time with, because nothing has changed for us as a country. And ever since we went to the IMF from 1966, those structural bottlenecks that keep us going there have still not changed. We need political leadership to come to a realization that these structural bottlenecks, if we do not solve them, will not let us stop going to the IMF. And I remember in 2019 when we were leaving, I mentioned in one of my interviews that not until we begin to expand the domestic base of our economy so that we are able to mobilize enough domestic resources to fund our development expenditure, we are going to have this problem every time with our fiscal deficits, a build-up of our debts, and then having to go back to the IMF. Now to your question, yes. If you look at our debt, over the COVID period, don't forget that whatever support we got from the IMF are still loans. They are not free money that we got. So whatever we did in that year with a reduction in revenues, with those very populist expenditure that we carried out in that year, of course, the idea of that the government then was to save lives. And we were prepared to go all lengths to help Ghanaians to be able to withstand the COVID and let people who were not working have some reliefs in terms of electricity and water. And so that definitely was going to come at a cost to this country. And so then in 2021, we noticed a huge deficit. At the end of 2021, we noticed a huge deficit. Our economy had not still recovered. 2021, the deficit reduced a bit to 12.1. And so we kept on piling on the debt. So the debt that we have up almost about 80% has been a cumulative effect of what happened in the COVID year and 2021. And so you ask yourself, why do we keep on borrowing? Because when you run fiscal deficit, somebody got to fund it. They got to borrow. Why do we keep on persistently running fiscal deficits? It's at the structure of our economy. And the point that I'm making, and I agree to some extent with Atu Fossey, but Atu knows clearly that the issues that confronted us in 2015 are still very prevalent now. Nothing has changed. If anything at all, we're moving on the right track until COVID hit. And COVID exposed us. The Russia-Ukraine war has also further exposed us, this time on the balance of payment side. Not really on the fiscal deficit, but the balance of payment. Because look, oil prices are increasing. We don't see an end to the war. The central bank has to at least provide some resources to the BDCs to import oil. So central bank will go and support them. The central bank has to also try to support the currency. But what is important to note is the loss of confidence by our investors, especially those non-resident investors who invest in our economy. Now, at the end of 2021, when we read the 2022 budget, investors did not have confidence that the fiscal consolidation of 4.7% of GDP, we're going to realize it. And the reasons why our investors were not confident was that the government had forgotten that it had a hung parliament, a parliament that was almost equal with the opposition, and they were not going to be easy to carry out some of the revenue measures that they thought they could use to raise 20% of GDP domestic revenue. And that in itself gave a clear indication to the investors that the consolidation that Ghana was promising most likely was not going to be. So I agree that at that time, investors began to reverse their capital flows. And that in itself was also posing a challenge, which in itself, apart from the global inflation and all of that, also meant that the central bank, which had done so well in controlling inflation and seeing the banking system reforms through, had to also increase interest rates, try to hold on to the reversals. But don't also forget that there are other two things that we have to contend with. One was the banking center crisis that we went through. The government has to incur huge debts to try to clean up the banking system. As we speak, I mean, I've had observation of a lot of banking system stress tests that have been done that shows our banking system is now very resilient. which is good for us as an economy if you are looking to use our domestic capacity to develop our country. Our banking system is key. The financial system should be well lubricated and stable. But it also added to our debt. So as we speak, our debt is not sustainable.
Yeah, I mean, and I guess the question I'm asking on the back of the debt situation you just mentioned is, now we're going to start negotiating. How much of a hindrance is that going to be? Will that, at this current debt level, will the IMF look upon us favorably for a program?
Obviously, I mean, these days, obviously, you go there with the programs that are homegrown solutions to your problem. So we are going to have to negotiate that. But to be honest with you, the government will have to make some very difficult decisions. And Ghanaians should be made aware that these are difficult times. I mean, obviously, we are going to have to rationalize some items of expenditure, which is quite clear. We also need to be very aggressive at domestic resource mobilization. As for the debt, it is there. What the IMF would help us do is to give some confidence so that those capital flow reversals would cease. Then it's possible that it could even allow us to gain access back into the Eurobond market, because the announcement effect alone led to almost 64% increase in the what do you call it, our bond issue. So that itself is also something that will help us. But the current debt would be at the center of the negotiations. And I'm very certain that the IMF is going to give us a time that we should look as much as possible how best reduce it. There are two ways we can do that.
How?
If we're able to bring our fiscal deficits below the 5% threshold as soon as possible and grow the economy by more than 5%, then in itself is going to lead to a reduction in the debt to GDP ratio, because the GDP is increasing faster than the debt, which is something we can do. We also need to find out the extent to which we can rationalize our expenditure so that we begin to invest more in public investment, expanding the domestic base of our economy, so I can put more youth to work, we can put more people to work, tax them, and increase our domestic resource mobilization. Because that is also key. If you're able to do this, these are the structural problems that we have. And also begin to take a look at how we can encourage domestic firms to produce import competing goods, so that we also reduce our reliance on imported goods.
In that case,
these are the two things. These are the two structural bottlenecks that we have not solved since 1966. And we are always having to go to the IMF because our debts get unsustainable, our fiscal deficits, we are not able to solve it. Our balance of payment challenges are there. Then we run to the IMF for support.
So one of the things you said, it boils down to, one, showing the IMF that we can raise enough revenue. But then it begs the question, should the e-levy then stay? Should it be part of the offerings we present to the IMF as, listen, evidence of us trying to raise more revenue?
I mean, I don't think that the e-levy is something that we should look at. We should. I was even expecting the media review that Minister of Finance would take away that e-levy. And for good reasons. There are two good reasons. The telcos, when they have a drop in the number of consumers that use the e-levy, has implications for their profitability. And if we take profit from them, corporate taxes on their profit, that would mean that the government is even going to get less taxes from the telcos. We should rather support the telcos and Ghanaians to make more use of the digital technology, and then the telcos, the services that they offer, let the telcos do very well, make more profit, and then we tax the profit.
Okay.
We shouldn't discourage people from using their services because they provide a lot of resources for our economy as well. Secondly, there are other tax handles that we could make use of. How many cars do we have in Ghana? Let's take a figure of 5 million cars. If every year, every car is paying 400 cedis as part of the roadworthy.
No, but we tried that before. They under we tried that and it didn't work, and then they took it off.
No, why didn't it work? I mean, it was wrong. We shouldn't have taken that off. I mean, we shouldn't have taken that off.
It became a nuisance. I remember this very well. It became a nuisance.
Why did it become a nuisance? If you are going to renew your roadworthy, you pay that money. If you don't pay,
I mean,
you don't have a roadworthy. Why did it become a nuisance?
Very interesting. Stay with me.
It was because it was only a class of people who were paying those taxes who were influential that got that tax to be moved. But that shouldn't have been removed. If we are removing the road tolls and we need money to fund our road infrastructure, every car in this country in a year, if it goes for its roadworthy, should be asked to pay some money to go into the road fund directly to support our road infrastructure.
Well, interesting thoughts
we have challenges that we need to fund to expand our economy. Not until we do that and our parties go on politicking with what they will do and what they will not do, Ghana will be where we are, and we'll go to the IMF, and this will not be the last time.
I mean, Prof, stay with me. So the revenue handles will be key. I mean, we talk about the debt. He says 2 things you need to do to prove to the IMF that you can bring your debt down. One of the obviously your revenue. Do you agree with him about the e-levy? That kick it off. He doesn't expect that. That should be part of the conversation in terms of revenue.
Evans, the e-levy has become counterproductive and is highly distortionary. It is a tax that must go and go now. Okay. In fact, Ghana will stand to lose if we continue implementing e-levy than to gain.
So you're saying that when the negotiators sit at the round table with the IMF, they shouldn't add the e-levy?
I think it should go.
And
they should come to the public with a new sense of hope and confidence and assure the people that we are bringing in new tax measures instead of the e-levy.
What are you suggesting? Because they should impose new taxes?
Evans, let me give you, I'm not suggesting they should impose taxes. Evans, let me give you some numbers.
Well, Prof says impose a vehicle tax of assault.
I want you to put this in perspective. In 2016, and a boy is listening to me, 2016, we needed 66% of Ghana's tax revenue to service our debt. 2019, fast forward to 2019, Ghana needed 73% of our tax revenue to service our debt. And that is where I started seeing the red flag.
Okay. That's a significant jump.
In 2020, we needed 87% of our tax revenue to service our debt.
That's almost everything.
And then in 2021, we needed 90% of tax revenue to service our debt. First quarter 2021, we needed 108% of our tax revenue to service our debt. You see, so while the debt is increasing, and I saw a graph that you did, very interesting graph, and you could see it widening.
Yeah.
You could see it
significantly,
widening.
From 2019.
Exactly, from 2019. And this is exactly what I've given to you.
Yes.
So in the first quarter 2021, all the taxes we collect in this economy is not enough to pay the debt, to service the debt that we have borrowed. This is because of reckless borrowings for consumption. This is a fact. Now Ghana has 3 options going into the table with IMF. 1, negotiate a standard IMF program.
What's that?
Like what we had in the last few IMF programs that we have. So
including the 2015 one?
Including the 2015 one.
Okay.
A standard IMF program that is going to target at fiscal consolidation. So you deal with the problem with what you call revenue and expenditure adjustment. Because you are using 108% of your entire revenue, in fact, everything of your revenue
plus more.
In nominal terms, Ghana tax revenue for the first quarter was 12.9 billion. You service our debt with 13.9 billion. So you need to go and borrow another 1 billion to come and pay the debt. That is what it is. That makes it 108%. Now, if you want to do a standard IMF program, you have to, because now it's revenue. Your revenue is not enough to pay your debt, so it would mean that you have to increase taxes and do what about compliance and both measures and compliance to bring the tax up to a level that you get to probably 60 or 50%. And that is going to mean that Ghanaians will have to go through pain, massive pain from the tax side. This is before you go to expenditure, because remember, the one we are talking about, expenditure is not part of it. It's only the debt that you are dealing with. So you have to first increase the taxes.
Prof says one of the areas in terms of new taxes is a vehicle tax. Do you agree with him?
Oh, I'm on record to have supported this.
But they pulled it away.
But you see, I knew it was going to fail because of the design.
Okay.
The design was problematic, and I pointed to them, and parliamentary hands that bears me
so
out. Because
how can it be done differently?
You see, they targeted only a class of tax group. They call it luxury vehicle tax.
Yes, luxury vehicles, yes.
I was saying that rather impose an emission tax, because the cars out there are actually polluting the environment in the form of
so everybody else will pay.
Everybody.
Once you own a car,
you have to pay. And then it covers everybody. And you will not, and then you graduate it. If you're a small car, you pay smaller amount. If you a bigger car, you pay a bigger amount, like PAYE sort of. So it depends on what you go in for. If I'm using 5.7 liter car, I shouldn't be paying the same as somebody using 1 liter car. So something like that will be compelling everybody else to.
But the way we are now with the current economic condition, you take the vehicle tax, but what else can government tax?
Evans. And that is why I want us to move the conversation above just taxes and revenue.
Okay.
And that is my major concern. I've heard government communicators, trying to talk about what they will get in IMF program.
Yeah.
That is wrong. The IMF does not lend to countries with unsustainable debt at high debt distress levels. They don't lend to them. You can go to the IMF website and check. The articles of agreement will point to you that the fund will not give you a program. You can even be Jesus Christ. You won't get a program because their money is revolving, and that when they give it to you, they have to get it back and give it to another country when they need a rise.
I made a point. It's simple. If you go to a bank to borrow,
exactly.
You have to prove to the bank that.
And the IMF is not an ATM.
Yes.
That you go and put your card in because you're a member, you put it in, you press your pin and you get money.
Yeah, you may actually have just like a bank. I have an account with a certain bank, but that doesn't mean that if I go there, they will automatically give me money. You have to show that you can pay back.
So, and that's why I say we have 3 options. A standard IMF loan, IMF program with restructuring immediately, or IMF program with restructuring within 12 months. I think the first one will be too painful for the people of Ghana. Standard IMF loan program will be too painful for the people of Ghana, because if you look at the kind of work that we have to do as a country, where our debt levels are.
But you did it in 2015. Why can't you do it now?
At that time, we were using 66%. In fact, 2015, we're using about 52% of our tax revenue to service our debt.
So the
workload is not the same.
I get it. So the medicine you took was better, but now it will be extremely better. It will be far more better than
Evans,
you can even imagine.
The key difference between the 2015 IMF program and the possible 2022 or 2023 IMF program is the debt levels.
Yeah.
Is the debt levels. The debt will make all the difference Ghana will see.
So in other words, and you make the point, if you're going to introduce taxes, if you needed 2 billion, now you probably need...
You need more.
More.
You need more.
So which means that you're imposing far more taxes.
Far more taxes.
At percentages
even before you get to expenditure. So 2 things are going to happen. Tax hikes are inevitable. Expenditure cut is inevitable. But the question is, can Ghana take it at this time of our distress? We cannot.
Okay, so you're saying that first option you had in 2015 is off the table?
It's off the table.
Okay.
So now the 3 that I'm talking about, 2 is what is left. IMF program with restructuring. From where I sit and the numbers I see and what I've read around, I think restructuring is inevitable.
Restructuring of what?
Restructuring of Ghana's debt is inevitable.
But will the investors
something
agree?
That will happen. Oh, it's not about investors agreeing. It's about government taking a decision and calling the investors to the table. And this is going to be the first time Ghana is going to restructure a debt. It's equivalent to HIPIC, telling this time your commercial debt holders, not your domestic, not your bilateral and multilateral debt holders, but this time your commercial debt holders that mean to be.
Has that ever happened anywhere before?
Oh, it is. There are a lot of precedent. You can read around.
But that's really, it sounds like a very last option.
Yes. It is. I will not call it a last option. I think it's currently, as I see it, from where I sit and what I see, what I've read around, I think it is inevitable.
Call the investors to say, "You mean to ya?" But that sounds outrageous.
It is coming. And that is why I'm saying the government should stop blaming Ukraine and Russia war, but rather they have to start communicating to Ghanaians with humility. And in fact, asking or soliciting the support of the people of Ghana to go through this painful process that is ahead of us.
Okay.
Because it's going to be painful.
Stay with me. Let me get, Prof, do you agree with that?
No, I don't agree with that. I don't think that we got into that point where we need to do debt restructuring. Call our creditors and talk to them. No, I don't buy that. I think that the first option is still something on the table that Ghana should look at. Our negotiators should go and look at that. We need to let Ghanaians know that these are difficult choices that we are going to make. And you see, Evans, that is the problem with our politicians. At times, the political costs of these choices deter them for taking us through those difficult choices that will get Ghana off this situation of perennial going to the IMF for support. And that is quite unfortunate. We need to be clean with Ghanaians. And the Ghanaian that I've grown to know, if he's told the truth, that look at, these are difficult times. This is the solution to our problems. This is how we can get around this. I think that Ghanaians would
Prof, are you sure? That. Because tonight, as we speak, you are a lecturer yourself. You know this. All the 4 unions of teachers in the pre-tertiary have all called the strike beginning tomorrow. So our kids in the basic school tomorrow have teachers. UTAC has issued a statement that they will not listen to the government because of IMF. TUC, even a stronger statement. I mean, that clearly is telling you the Ghanaian worker is not ready to tolerate it.
The government does.
It's because the Ghanaian worker has over the time seen that if there has to be any sacrifice being made in Ghana, it is the ordinary people who sacrifice, not the politicians. And that is quite key. If the president announces a cut in his ministers of state, drops the number down to 170, and announces some very radical revenue measures from the executive, and Ghanaians see that happening, Ghanaians would accept. Look, Ghanaians have always come to the point that, look, it doesn't matter how hard they sacrifice. The politician is not prepared to sacrifice. If Ghana announces that, look, in 2024, there is nothing, we are not going to pay any end of service benefit to any member of parliament. If we as lecturers have had to sit down over the years and not got any salary increases, they are not better than us. Yes, we give them all due respect. They are members of parliament, but they are not better than us. Secondly, we do not need to increase parliament. If anything at all, Ghanaians to come to a firm decision that we don't need more than 100 members of parliament in this country, because we have a local government system that should be able to be agents of development in our respective districts. We don't need our members of parliament to be agents of development. They should be lawmakers, and they should go to parliament to go and make laws for Ghana and serve the country like any other Ghanaian worker is doing. They are not better than any ordinary Ghanaian worker for them to have the luxury of having cars being loaned out for them and being paid those huge salaries because they promised some voters that when I come to power, I'm going to pay your school fees and all of that. That should stop. If we see that happening, the Ghanaian that I know, I'm also a Ghanaian, I'm also a lecturer, I'm being grossly underpaid. But I'll accept a situation like that when I see that every Ghanaian is sacrificed. And I'm sure the unions that are out there would also accept that, look, if this will get us to get to the point where we need to look back and say, no, we are not going back to IMF, we've gotten things right. I think that Ghanaians will accept it.
Okay.
But the sacrifice shouldn't come only but to the ordinary low income, not well-to-do Ghanaian. Everybody should be part of it. You
should bear the brand. Prof, thank you very much. Your quick 30 seconds on this.
Evans, I agree with Debo when he made the case that we should all burden share. There's something we call leadership by example. We should lead by example, particularly the political class, and it should start with the president. He should be seen that he's being prudent. Then to the ministers, they should be seen to being prudent. And then we, the members of parliament, we should be seen as such.
You're on record to have said that you're prepared to take a cut.
I'm on record, and I've said this because I've seen the numbers and I think it's not healthy. We should lead by example. Time has come to reform the pay structure of office holders, political office holders. The time has come. And you cannot go to the table if you yourself are culprit. And that is why I'm urging the president in particular to start leading all of us, the political class, towards that reform. And that will be the trigger where the labor will start accepting it. This is self-inflicted. It's unfortunate we are where we are, but Evans, it is not going to be easy. It's going to be tough.
Yeah, absolutely. Tomorrow we're going to have a conversation with the workers. I mean, the IMF bailout impact on workers. We're going to get the workers together. Let's have a conversation about this. Because already today they've issued many statements warning that the government should not bring the IMF up in their negotiations. So I'll try and gauge that when I speak to them tomorrow. Enjoy the rest of the evening.